For centuries, the Eldridge family carried a shame so deep it could rot the bones of the living. It festered behind closed doors, whispered among the walls, and seeped into the soil where their ancestors had fallen. When the first child of the latest generation was born, the family dared to believe that salvation had come at last. They called the baby their forgiven one, a chance to erase the sins of hundreds of years. For centuries, the Eldridge family had been haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of their own history. Every generation carried a burden of shame so deeply rooted that it seemed to pulse through the very walls of their ancestral home. Whispers of betrayal, cruelty, and transgression had been passed down in fragments that were never spoken aloud in polite company, but lingered in old journals, tattered letters, and the quiet glances of the elders. It was said that the family's misdeeds had begun long before the house itself was built, stretching back to a time when honor was measured in cruelty and fear. Tales of violence, of alliances broken, and of children abandoned for sins both real and imagined formed the hidden skeleton of the family's reputation. Each member grew up under the oppressive weight of knowing that their bloodline was marked, and though the sins of the past were never fully understood, their presence was always felt. The anticipation of the forgiven child had been nurtured over decades, whispered about in secret conversations, and invoked in prayers that trembled with equal parts hope and fear. The elders spoke cautiously, as though naming the child too openly might summon a reckoning before it could be avoided. This child was meant to carry the promise of redemption, to cleanse the family of the shame that had clung to them like a second skin. Yet, even in the hope, there was an undercurrent of dread. The journals contained warnings, stories of children thought to bring salvation, but who instead had only deepened the family's suffering, leaving scars that never healed and opening wounds that generations could never close. The handwriting in the margins, sometimes hurried, sometimes ornate, spoke of fear, of anticipation, and of the unshakable belief that the past would not easily release its grip. Within the house, the air seemed to respond to these legacies. The floors creaked as though burdened with the weight of secrets. The windows held shadows that never fully dispersed, and the portraits of ancestors seemed to watch, their painted eyes following the living with judgment. Every member of the family, from the oldest matriarchs to the youngest children, understood that the birth of the forgiven child would not simply be a celebration. It would be a test, a challenge to see if centuries of shame could truly be erased. In quiet moments, late at night, the elders would trace the lines of history and mutter about the dangers of expectation, for they had learned that the family's attempts to redeem itself often led not to salvation, but to horrors unforeseen. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that when the child arrived, it would awaken something long dormant, something that had waited patiently in the shadows of history, and that the consequences of this birth could echo far beyond the walls of the Eldridge home. The birth of the child came on a night when the moon hung low and red in the sky, casting an unnatural glow over the Eldridge estate. The air was thick and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. From the first cry, it was clear that this child was unlike any other. The sound was piercing yet oddly hollow, reverberating in the walls of the old house, and carrying a chill that sank into the bones of those who heard it. Nurses and midwives recoiled, unable to meet its eyes, and even the most stoic family members felt a tremor of fear that they could not explain. The baby's skin had an odd pallor, almost translucent, and its small limbs twitched in ways that seemed unnatural, jerking with a rhythm that belonged to no human heartbeat. Its gaze, when it opened its eyes, was unnervingly alert, as if it were aware of everyone in the room, yet unconcerned with their presence. The house itself seemed to respond to the child's arrival. Candles flickered and guttered, drafts moving in directions no window could account for. Shadows shifted across the walls, stretching and coiling like living things, and in the silence between the cries, a faint whispering seemed to echo from the corners of the room, words that could not be understood but carried an unmistakable weight of warning. Family members watched in a mixture of awe and terror as the infant's presence seemed to warp the space around it. Small objects trembled on shelves, and the temperature dropped in sudden pockets of cold that left breath visible in the warm air. Even the family dog, A creature that had known loyalty and comfort in the home for years, whimpered and backed away from the crib, tail tucked, ears flattened, as though recognizing something older and more primal than fear itself. Attempts to soothe the child were met with strange resistance. Its cries sometimes ceased the moment someone approached, only to begin again in a different room, or the sound would stretch unnaturally, lingering long after the child had been quiet. Feeding and care seemed to provoke strange reactions. Milk curdled before it could be swallowed, and the swaddling blankets developed dark stains that would not wash out. The midwives, experienced women who had seen countless births, exchanged looks of disbelief and horror, murmuring prayers under their breath and consulting their ancient superstitions in hushed tones. The family's excitement at finally welcoming their forgiven child was quickly overshadowed by a deep, instinctive dread. Whispers began to spread through the halls that the child might not be a blessing at all, that some unseen force had taken hold of its form from the very moment of birth, shaping it into something terrifyingly wrong, something that might carry the weight of the family's past misdeeds in ways no one could yet comprehend. As the days passed, the Eldridge household grew increasingly divided over the child. Some members clung desperately to the belief that the infant was a symbol of redemption, the long-awaited chance to cleanse centuries of shame and wrongdoing. They spoke in hushed tones of hope and careful plans for the future, imagining that the child's presence could finally erase the family's dark legacy. These members spent hours tending to the baby, offering lullabies and whispered prayers, trying to coax what little semblance of normalcy they could from the unnatural circumstances. They saw the child's strange behaviors as mere signs of sensitivity, the extraordinary awareness of one destined for a special purpose, and they clung to that belief as tightly as a drowning person clutches a rope. Yet others were less convinced, their fear growing with each passing day. They saw in the child not a miracle, but a warning, a living embodiment of the sins that had festered through generations. Every unexplained tremor in the house, every flicker of shadow, every chilling cry of the infant seemed to confirm what they had long suspected, that the family's history was not one to be erased, but one that demanded reckoning. Arguments broke out over small decisions, whether to let outsiders see the child, how to care for it, and even whether the family should remain together within the walls of the old estate. Long simmering grudges rose to the surface as fear magnified every past slight, every whispered insult, and every betrayal remembered by those old enough to recall the darker times. The tension within the house was not confined to words alone. Small incidents began to signal the growing divide. Objects were found moved or broken in ways no one could explain. Mirrors cracked in patterns resembling distorted faces, and the air itself sometimes seemed to thrum with anger or sorrow. The once sturdy walls of the Eldridge home, which had stood as a monument to family pride for generations, now felt suffocating, pressing in on those who walked its halls. Even meals, once a time for communal comfort, became battlegrounds, with arguments flaring over trivialities, each side reading the infant's every gesture as proof of either salvation or doom. Outside the house, the neighbors began to notice a change as well. Whispers traveled quickly, and soon the family's internal strife became a topic of speculation. The children in the nearby town spoke in hushed tones of seeing shadows moving behind curtains, of hearing cries that chilled the blood, and of glimpsing the baby's strange eyes through the windows late at night. Some elders warned that the Eldridge family had invited misfortune upon themselves by clinging to hope while ignoring warnings, while others felt pity, believing that fear alone was poisoning the household. Within the house, the emotional tension thickened until it was almost tangible, a living force pressing down on every corner, and it became painfully clear that the arrival of the child was forcing the family to confront not only its present fears but the festering darkness of its own fractured history. The first true sign that something was profoundly wrong arrived unexpectedly, shattering whatever fragile sense of safety the Eldridge family had tried to maintain. A neighbor, a man who had lived near the estate for decades and had long been privy to the family's whispered reputation, was found lying unconscious at the edge of the property, his body marked with deep scratches and bruises that seemed almost deliberate in their cruelty. The local constable inspected the scene, puzzled, noting no signs of an intruder, no footprints beyond those already familiar to the family, and no weapon that could account for the injuries. Whispers began to spread rapidly through the town, and the Eldridge home, already heavy with tension, grew heavier still, as if the walls themselves were aware of the new horror. Inside the house, the family was immediately torn between denial and fear. Those who had clung to hope tried to rationalize the incident, insisting that it was a coincidence, a random act of misfortune with no connection to the child. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Items within the home had been shifted, moved, and broken in patterns that mirrored the injuries sustained by the neighbor, suggesting an uncanny awareness of the world beyond the walls. The child, once held as a symbol of redemption, was now seen by many as the epicenter of something dark, something that reached beyond human understanding. Its cries seemed to echo in the room even when it was asleep, resonating with a presence that felt ancient and judgmental. Fear began to fracture the household in new ways. Family members who had once tolerated each other's skepticism now found themselves in heated arguments, accusations spilling over into the open for the first time. Some insisted that the child be isolated, that extreme measures must be taken to protect both the family and the surrounding community. Others recoiled at the very idea, unable to bear the thought of abandoning what they still insisted was a gift, even as the signs of danger became impossible to dismiss. Tension became palpable, seeping into every corner of the home, turning once familiar spaces into arenas of suspicion. Outside, the town's collective unease grew. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of the unnatural atmosphere surrounding the Eldridge property. Doors that had always remained shut were said to creak open on their own. Windows reflected shadowed figures that no one had entered, and faint cries carried across the fields late at night, chilling anyone who heard them. Children refused to play near the edges of the estate, and adults crossed the street to avoid the unsettling presence that seemed to hang around the house like smoke. The Eldridge family could no longer pretend that the child's existence was anything but extraordinary, and the first incident had forced them to confront the terrifying possibility that what they had long feared, the child's unnatural nature, was now very real and rapidly moving beyond anyone's ability to control or understand. As the weeks passed, the Eldridge estate began to show signs of a creeping decay that could not be explained by age or neglect. The land surrounding the house, once fertile and green, started to wither under a sun that seemed as if it could no longer penetrate the oppressive atmosphere. Crops that should have thrived drooped in the fields, their leaves curling and blackening in unnatural patterns, while the livestock, usually sturdy and healthy, fell ill with ailments that no veterinarian could diagnose. Even the trees lining the perimeter of the property began to twist into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands, as if recoiling from the presence within the house. Within the walls, the deterioration was subtler but no less unsettling. Plaster peeled in strange, almost deliberate patterns, and floorboards groaned and shifted as if responding to some hidden force. The family soon realized that these changes coincided with moments when the child was awake, particularly when it emitted its piercing, unnatural cries or stared with those eyes that seemed far too knowing for a newborn. Curtains would flutter despite the absence of a breeze, and shadows began to behave erratically, stretching unnaturally and gathering in corners where no light fell. Objects fell or moved without cause, as if the house itself were reacting to the child's presence. Some of the more fearful family members began to whisper that the infant was not just unusual, but an active force, one whose very existence was reshaping the world around it. They noted that even animals refused to enter certain rooms, lingering at thresholds with heads lowered and backs arched, sensing something beyond their comprehension. Attempts to understand the phenomenon only deepened the family's unease. Old diaries and journals from ancestors hinted at a recurring pattern, a suggestion that the house had always been responsive to the sins and misdeeds of its residents. These writings described similar events: failing crops, dying livestock, rooms filled with unnatural chill, but they always concluded with ominous warnings that those who invoked the family's forgiven child would awaken something beyond reckoning. As the family reread these passages, the weight of their heritage pressed upon them, a reminder that the shame and cruelty of their forebears were not merely stories, but active forces that could linger, waiting for the right circumstances to manifest. Outside observers began to notice changes too. Travelers reported seeing mist cling to the edges of the property, low and thick, moving unnaturally, as if it were alive. The wind carried faint whispers, or so it seemed, and townsfolk claimed that animals avoided the grounds entirely, even those with no reason to fear human habitation. Within the house, the tension among the family grew unbearable. Arguments erupted over every minor decision, with some insisting the child should be kept hidden from the world, while others argued for its protection at any cost. With each passing day, the estate itself seemed less like a home and more like a living entity, one that groaned and shifted, watching and waiting as the child at its center continued to exert a power that none of them fully understood. Desperation began to take hold within the Eldridge household as the unnerving signs of the child's presence grew impossible to ignore. Some members, long convinced that the infant's unnatural nature could be corrected, turned to the old family journals in search of guidance. These tomes, written by ancestors who had dealt with similar disturbances, contained rituals and incantations meant to purge evil or restore balance, though they were cryptic, fragmentary, and often accompanied by warnings of dire consequences. Driven by a mixture of fear and hope, a group of family members decided to attempt one such ritual, believing that if they could merely follow the instructions precisely, they might reclaim the normalcy that had been lost. The preparation itself was painstaking and tense. Candles were arranged in precise formations, herbs were burned in patterns that produced acrid, choking smoke, and chants, long forgotten by most of the family, were recited with trembling voices. Every sound, every movement, seemed amplified in the heavy silence of the house, and even the most resolute participants felt an undercurrent of dread, as though unseen eyes were watching and judging every misstep. The child, meanwhile, remained still, observing with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes, and every so often, its cry would pierce the room, slicing through the ritual with a force that made the participants stumble and falter. When the ritual began in earnest, the house itself seemed to respond. Floors shook slightly, shadows lengthened and writhed, and the air grew dense, heavy with a pressure that made breathing difficult. The child's wails became keener, cutting through the room like glass, and the flames of the candles bent and twisted toward it as if drawn to its presence. It became clear almost immediately that something had gone wrong. Rather than diminishing the child's influence, the ritual seemed to amplify it, intensifying the unnatural occurrences that had plagued the household. Objects flew from shelves, doors slammed shut with violent force, and the walls themselves groaned as if in protest. Family members were thrown into panic, realizing that their well-intentioned actions had only made the situation more volatile. The consequences were immediate and undeniable. Where once the land had shown signs of slow decay, now it seemed to rot with alarming speed. Livestock collapsed in the fields, crops shriveled and blackened overnight, and a darkness began to hang over the house that felt almost tangible, pressing against the skin and lungs of everyone within. The family, initially filled with hope, now trembled at the realization that their efforts had provoked something older, something beyond comprehension. Even the most steadfast among them began to whisper that the child was not a being to be corrected or tamed, but a force in its own right, one that responded to fear and desperation with increasing potency. The ritual, intended as salvation, had become the trigger for a new, more terrifying stage of their ordeal, leaving them to confront a reality they had long feared yet could not have fully imagined. The discovery came in the form of a hidden journal, long buried beneath the floorboards of the Eldridge estate, its leather cover cracked and brittle with age. It had been written by an ancestor whose warnings had been overlooked or dismissed for generations, and now, with trembling hands, one of the more cautious family members opened it to reveal its contents. The handwriting was jagged, erratic in places, as though the writer had struggled to contain the fear and urgency that had driven them to record every observation. Within the pages lay the revelation that would change everything. The child, far from being the long-awaited savior or redeemer of the family, was instead a vessel of retribution, a living embodiment of the consequences of centuries of misdeeds. The sins that had been whispered about in fragments, The betrayals, cruelties, and acts of abandonment had not simply faded with time. They had persisted, festering, gathering strength, and the child had been shaped by this cumulative weight into something terrifying and purposeful. As the family read, a chill spread through the room, crawling along the spine like a living thing. The journal described previous generations who had encountered similar births, children whose arrival had been marked by unnatural phenomena and whose existence had culminated in disaster. The warnings were explicit. Attempts to raise such a child as a normal member of the family or to suppress its nature would only provoke its wrath. The forgiven child was not meant to heal the wounds of the past, but to confront the family with them, to force acknowledgement of every injustice and cruelty committed by the bloodline. The realization was almost unbearable. Every unexplained incident, every shadow that had moved too quickly, every cry that had sent shivers through the house, now took on a new, horrifying clarity. The implications rippled through the household immediately. Those who had still clung to hope were shaken, their faith in redemption crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Arguments erupted over how to respond, but any plan seemed futile. The journal made it clear that the child's actions were not the result of malice in the human sense, but of a cosmic, ancestral reckoning that could not be negotiated or ignored. The house itself seemed to respond to the family's fear, groaning and shifting as if acknowledging the truth of the journal's contents. Even the land outside the property, which had been suffering under strange decay, seemed to intensify its decline, mirroring the household's growing dread. As the family absorbed the revelation, the atmosphere in the estate became suffocating. It was no longer just a home shadowed by a difficult birth. It had become a theater of judgment, where every creak of the floorboards and flicker of candlelight reminded them that the child's purpose was inexorable. The past, long buried and obscured by time, had not forgiven them, and the child, in all its unnatural awareness, was the embodiment of a punishment that was now impossible to escape. The knowledge of the child's true nature left the Eldridge family trapped between fear and inevitability, with the horrifying certainty that the reckoning was only beginning. The climax of the Eldridge family's ordeal arrived with a night so heavy and still that the air seemed to thrum with a presence all its own. By this point, the house had become unrecognizable, every familiar corner warped by the child's influence. The walls groaned under a pressure that seemed almost sentient, shadows pooled and stretched like liquid, and an unnatural chill clung to the rooms, seeping into the bones of anyone who dared enter. The family, already frayed by weeks of fear and division, faced a choice that no one could escape: abandon the child entirely, attempt to destroy it, or surrender to the terrifying force it had become. Every option carried a weight of consequence so severe that hesitation itself felt like a betrayal. Those who had once believed in redemption now understood that they were confronting something far older and far crueler than any human intention. The house itself seemed to respond to their indecision. Doors slammed without warning. The air vibrated with a low, mournful moan, and objects flew through the rooms with violent unpredictability. The child, small and deceptively fragile in appearance, observed with an intelligence and awareness that unnerved even the eldest matriarchs. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim candlelight, reflecting centuries of accumulated judgment and wrath, and its cries, though intermittent, carried a resonance that seemed to fracture the air itself. Family members felt as if the house were pressing inward, guiding them toward an unavoidable confrontation. Whispers that seemed not entirely human echoed in the corners, recounting past sins in fragmented tones, reminding the living that the legacy of cruelty, neglect, and betrayal was still very much alive and now embodied in this child. As night deepened, the family's debates turned into panicked action. Some attempted to remove the child from the estate, only to find hallways that stretched and shifted, doors that refused to open, and stairs that ended abruptly in darkness. Others tried protective measures, barriers of herbs, chants, and prayers, but each effort seemed only to provoke the house further, sending objects crashing through rooms and leaving streaks of frost on surfaces where warmth had previously lingered. It became clear that the child's power was not limited to mere physical influence. It was entwined with the very essence of the home, and perhaps with the land itself. Every act of defiance, every attempt to assert control, was met with a response that was terrifying in its precision, as if the child knew their intentions before they could be fully formed. By the early hours, exhaustion and fear had consumed most of the family. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows and noise, each corner hiding some unseen force, every creak or whisper threatening immediate catastrophe. The child, for its part, remained at the center, observing, waiting, a small figure with the weight of centuries of judgment behind it. In that moment, it was clear that the Eldridge family's fate was sealed not by choice alone, but by the inexorable reckoning that had been centuries in the making. The terror of the night pressed down on them from all sides, leaving them trapped in a reality where the past, the present, and the child's terrifying existence converged into an inescapable nightmare.